Welcome to ASD Unplugged, Managing Internet Use with Safety and Understanding Across the Lifespan. My name is Madeline Barger. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work in the Weissman Center Autism Treatment Programs here with Molly Murphy. I act as the clinical coordinator across programs, and I also act as a clinician in the Growing Together and Transitioning Together programs. And I work primarily with teens and young adults, but have experience over the last 8 years working with children with autism and their families across the lifespan. And this is probably one of my most favorite topics to talk about with providers and parents. I have a certificate in internet psychology, and I'm pursuing certification as a board-certified behavior analyst. And I think all of these things sort of mix together to help form what my treatment outlook is for managing internet use. So internet and ASD. First, we're going to talk about some common treatment patterns. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when I see teens or young adults with autism who've been working with internet use for a long time, typical sort of internet addiction or video game addiction programs haven't been really helpful to them. And so I'm sort of exploring a little bit more about why that is. So we'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about some technology concepts for parents. Internet rules will cover really important ways to implement internet rules in your household, but I think it's also important to understand the technology concepts and the evidence-based treatment that informs them. And then I'll share some concepts from internet psychology and how they interplay with a neurological difference. And I'm a marriage and family therapist, and what that really means is I'm a systems therapist, so when I work with somebody, I think about the whole person. So how they function in their body and in their mind, in their interpersonal relationships, and in their support systems is really important to me. And then finally, we'll talk about behavior analysis and how it relates to technology. And if we have time, we'll get to the digital age in our brains. So first, here's some common treatment patterns with ASD and internet use. You'll see on one side we have a lot of positives, and on one side we have some challenges. And for every positive in this work I do, there's a challenge that is presented. So first, what we know from treatment practice is that healthy patterns can be developed from a young age with internet and video game use for children. We can start with children as young as 4 or 5 and talk to them about how long they can use the computer, how many breaks they need when they use the computer, and how to get parents if something scary or sort of inappropriate happens online. What's hard about that is we often forget that internet is an unregulated society, and to children born into the I generation, it's not as much a virtual world as it is to their parents. It's more real than it is virtual for a lot of children today. So if we don't act as the regulators and monitors of the society, then nobody really will. So it's really up to us as parents and providers. And the analogy I like to use with this is, think about if you would send your child alone into a park without supervision, and what skills do they have or what skills do they need in order to be safe. And we want to treat the online world the same way. Just because we can't see the danger, it's not inherent in our environment, we still want to be aware that there may be access to things that aren't appropriate for children online. Next, a positive is that oftentimes, just like the park analogy, the same rules we use for supervision and support for a child in the offline world could apply to the online world. So an example might mean if I am working with a child who struggles with being able to tell when to initiate a conversation with somebody or who's a stranger and who's somebody that's familiar, I'm going to assume first that those rules are going to apply for that person online and provide the appropriate supports. And then, of course, the challenge with that is oftentimes children with autism navigate this online world with greater skill than the offline world, and certainly with greater skill than I do. So I may think I've thought of every way to keep somebody safe and all these behaviors to work on, and then the child will find a way to access their favorite website without me being able to know how. So a positive about virtual worlds is children can improve communication through the use of technology. So for young children, what this looks like is, especially if they have autism and processing concerns, they've reported that it's kind of nice to be able to write out their thoughts, especially when talking about a tough subject with a parent, and they have more time to formulate what they want to say. And with teenagers, when they're experiencing launching and differentiating from their parents, a lot of times there can be some stress and some anger involved in that, and they've reported that being able to send a text message is much easier than a face-to-face conversation. Now, because this world is so inviting and is so safe, we have to think about when concerns arise. Often treatment protocols do not account for autism spectrum disorders, and I'll talk more about what the different treatment protocols are. And you'll see why they maybe don't always work if we don't look at a person as a whole system. And then finally, teens and young adults with autism report meaningful online relationships. I talk to a lot of young adults. They have their best friends online that live in different states. They've never met this person, but they have a real relationship that adds value to their life and their social experiences. And then, but of course what that means is that providers and parents will often as a group struggle to sort of compete with that online world because it's so much more interesting than anything else. So the bottom line is that we want to have an understanding of a young person's internet experience, and we hope that this leads to informed interventions that work, and I mean both proactive strategies for teaching internet safety up front and then also some reactive strategies for when something has gone awry. And first, so it's important to know what are the things we want to think about with a neurological difference like autism. We want to be working with people who understand the autism piece before we try to manage any internet behavior or video gaming concern. We want to have some information about behavioral science, what things are motivating this behavior, and what's the function of the behavior. And I'll talk about the 4 functions of human behavior and how they play out with video gaming in a little bit. We also want to be thinking about the I generation. So brains haven't necessarily changed, but thought patterns have changed for people born into a time with smartphones and Wi-Fi. So it can be helpful as a parent of any child to understand the difference. And then, of course, having some information about what happens to every single brain when it goes into an online virtual world can be helpful for making rules at home. And our end goal is the promotion of overall safety and happiness in your homes. That's what we do. So first, technology concepts for parents before we get into rules, that challenging behaviors relating to internet use are maintained by a behavioral function. So oftentimes, if somebody is maybe overusing the internet or video gaming for 15 hours a day, it's meeting some sort of need for the person. I always like to avoid pathologizing that and talk about what are they doing online, what feels good about it, what need is it meeting, and what can we maybe provide offline that helps to replace that need. And that usually helps avoid like a relapse back into the video gaming addiction. Next, we want to consider executive functioning and the impact of screens. So the parts of the brain that are impacted often by autism are also the parts of the brain that are used to perform tasks related to executive functioning. So if you're supporting a child as a parent or provider who struggles to remember things, to move from one task to the next, or require some support or prompting to get through like daily morning routines, then you may want to consider that screens are always going to be more interesting and more enticing than we are, and so removing them from the environment can really help with some of those things. And then next, this one, so I tend to take sort of an advocacy approach to working with autism rather than sort of a pathology approach. And so addiction versus perseveration comes up a lot. So a lot of times we call things that we really like addictions or obsessions, and sometimes they're just really high interests. And I think that's the piece that sometimes we miss with somebody with autism, is that they may really spend a lot of time online, but maybe they also spend a lot of time like fixing bikes or playing with trains. And so we want to make sure we're not pathologizing something that's just part of how they interact with the world. And it's really important for clinicians to know the difference in treatment, because these 2 first therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy is often used for video game addiction, and brief family therapy is often used, brief family therapy is used for video game addiction, and cognitive behavior therapy is used for internet addiction. And they're really helpful if you have a clinician who has a really strong understanding of autism, but if you can't find someone who really understands autism, what I'm finding is that a lot of teens and young adults are actually kind of flunking out of these programs, and they're having more success with applied behavior analysis interventions and with social skills interventions that sort of address all of their behavioral functions instead of these sort of rigorous addiction programs. Then another final technology concept for parents is this idea of internet natives versus internet immigrants. This is really helpful for me to think about why, even though maybe my generation came first, I sometimes feel like an outsider in the technology generation. So for those of us that were born into the world before there was a computer in our home or Wi-Fi or smartphones, we are considered internet or technology immigrants, even though our generation came first. And people that were born into a world where you have a smartphone and Wi-Fi are actually the internet natives. And so they may understand a lot more about this world than we do, even though they have spent less years in it. So that helps us to form some ideas when we're thinking about implementing internet rules. So first, the question always comes up of what's independent and what's supervised. And in one column, I want you to think about some things, and in the other column, we'll be specific about these things, right? So independent or supervised, it goes down to every single website or chat room or forum. What's independent and what's supervised? And then how much time is independent and how much time is supervised? Sometimes we will do a chart, a behavior chart, and track someone's online behavior, and we'll start to see patterns and, oh, they can be supervised and then be released for about 20 minutes and still be safe, but then after about that 20 minutes, they maybe find something that isn't appropriate. And then we also want to be really clear about what supervision looks like. So it could be on a continuum. It could be anything from, there are some children that in order to be safe, or teens or young adults, that based on their learning history, in order to be safe, they don't actually touch the computer. They just watch somebody go to their favorite websites in the beginning of treatment. And that's the intensity of the level of supervision they need. And then the other end of the continuum is somebody maybe only gets checked up on once an hour, and you just kind of walk by and make sure everything looks okay online. And so the main thing is that in one household, everybody has to be using the same level of supervision. Whatever that is up to you and your child and what can keep them safe. But we don't want to have like 3 or 4 different people using 3 or 4 different versions of supervision in one house. Then the next one is one of my favorite things to talk about is filters. So I think a lot of times we sort of think we're going to give a list of these great filters and then we're not going to have to learn any new behaviors because we can put a filter on and it'll save everybody from the inappropriate websites. But I want us to look at filters as learning tools. So they're sort of like training wheels. So in the same way that a toddler in a playpen, at some point the toddler grows out of the playpen, right? Learns how to climb over the gate or knock the whole thing over or open up the gate. Filters can be the same way. So they can be helpful sort of preventing some of these dangerous things and giving people a certain level of independence. But they're not an end-all be-all. We have to be learning independent safety online. And the other thing is that in response to when a child breaks a filter, a lot of times our instinct is to be a little bit punitive, but we have to just assume that it's going to happen. And so assume that a firewall will be crossed and a password will be found at some point in your household, and have a plan to respond that isn't necessarily punitive. It might just be, okay, we're ready to take the training wheels off, and we need to look at different options for internet use. And then the next thing to think about with internet rules is to start small with your time limits and expand, and I mean this in either direction. So think about what's a functional amount of time for somebody to use video gaming or internet. For young children, we're usually looking at how much time can we use the internet before distress happens. So if a child can use internet for an hour, take a break, and there's no distress, great. If you notice after that hour, there's lots of distress with that transition, you don't want somebody to then be online for longer than an hour. So start very small with young children. Then, unfortunately, it tends to be the opposite with a teenager or young adult. A lot of young adults with autism are actually, it's not uncommon for them to report they may use video gaming for 8 to 15 hours a day even. And so, and I totally empathize with the parents that want this to cut in half or even just be 2 hours a day. But in order to really find replacement behaviors for all this extra time that is now there, once we cut down from 15 hours of video gaming to 8, we have to move really slow. So we might have a goal in a week of 14 hours instead of 15 hours, not 8 hours instead of 15. So it's a really slow process once it builds up to that point, that level of intensity of use. And then finally, we don't want to underestimate a person's physiological needs. So your body parts need breaks from technology, like your hands, your eyes, your lower back, your neck, and your brain. And as we've evolved as a species from using books to television to video games, our sharp focus has increased, so we're able to sort of close out the world in these virtual spaces. But our bodies haven't caught up, and our brains haven't caught up. So people who spend 15 hours a day gaming, for example, they say that when they return to reality, they feel really disconnected. They feel disconnected from their feelings and from the people in their lives, right? So we still have to give our body parts breaks, even though our eyes, and we might think that our eyes are really focused and that we can be immersed in this world. So this moves us into internet psychology and our brains online. So a lot of times the first adventure in coming up with a behavior plan that works for everybody is a child reporting that they're multitasking. So I am getting my homework done. I'm doing it while I have Netflix on and a chat room up and there's music playing. And that's pretty common. It feels, to them it feels like they're accomplishing this, but what we found is that even though thought patterns have changed in the I generation, the brains haven't changed that much. and we're still not really able to multitask. So Dr. Laura Ballman did an experiment with 3 different experimental groups where she measured what we were able to retain if we didn't have any instant messaging, if we read a passage before we did some instant messaging, and if we did them both at the same time. And the answer is still the same as what we all think it is. We can't really multitask. We can teach ourselves to be distracted every 30 seconds, and we think that we're doing 2 things at once. But we want to remember your brain will sort of, what you practice is what your brain will learn. So we need to be careful with that. The next, another really cool sort of idea is the disinhibition effect. This is what happens with this is a theory about what happens by Dr. John Suhler to our brains, our minds, and our behaviors online. And so I'm going to go through each one of them pretty briefly, and I want us to think about how online, when these rules of behavior are at play, how the value of some of these social skills impact ASD, the value of these social skills go down online. So it's a really inviting world then. If all these things that I maybe find challenging or stressful, I don't need these skills online, then I'm never going to want to leave. So first we'll think about dissociative anonymity and invisibility. So this happens to everybody online. It's this idea that I can portray myself any way that I want, right? And you can't actually see me unless we're in a video chat. And so that really takes the value down of my appearance, my actual appearance, my physical traits, my hygiene routines. And I no longer really need to be able to read nonverbal cues or know what facial expressions mean or learn to admit them. And you can see where a lot of people with autism are reporting in the offline world, they want to have these skills so they can better understand their friends and their relationships. But there's some sense of relief online because these skills aren't as important. Then the next one is asynchronicity. This is really important when we think about processing concerns and communicative timing. So online, I can be responding to somebody at the same time that they're talking to me, right? I can also, in a text message, respond 3 hours later from the original message, and that's acceptable. If I do that in the walking-talking world, nobody wants to talk to me. So if I talk while you're talking and you ask me a question and I stand there for 3 hours and then I respond, that's not going to work in our relationship. So this has been both positive because people who report that they have some processing concerns really like that they don't have to respond and take turns talking. But it's also been really challenging. So for some of the 30-year-olds that I work with that have autism spectrum disorders, they've said, we worked really hard to have conversations in the walking, talking world. And now online, I don't get a text for 3 hours, so I end that friendship. And this is like a phenomenon, so we have to understand the difference in the communicative timing. And next is solipsistic introjection. That's really hard to say, but it's this idea that our minds meld together in these virtual worlds. So if it's a goal that that our minds meld and that we have the same thoughts and feelings, that sort of throws theory of mind and perspective taking to the wind because we're supposed to be having the same experience. But we know offline we need to understand that other people are having different thoughts and feelings and be able to discern the difference. So then finally we have dissociative imagination, minimizing authority, and altering self. So not only can I present myself online as somebody different from who I am offline, I can also actually imagine that world. So in World of Warcraft, I can be a night elf, right? And I'm not really a night elf, but I can take on that identity and share that world with people. And then minimizing authority is really important to understand because a lot of these video gaming chat room forums are monitored by 13-year-olds and nobody post up, I get 1 million responses, right? So there's an attention maintain factor. And then also, these virtual worlds are visually pleasing and personal items are attained. I always share and I'm not a gamer and I had never played before, and I swear for 3 days I was seeing coins and everything. Like, how many gold coins is this worth? So those tangible items became desirable to me even though I've never played a video game. So these are just some concrete ideas for parents about managing technology use proactively. One of them is a 15-minute non-tech per hour of tech. If you can get a 15-minute break for every hour, that's excellent. Then 3 to 4 non-technology family dinners a week, 30 to 45 minutes each. And then weekly 10 to 15-minute technology chats. Now these I practice with people because they can feel really awkward. So the parent talks for 5 to 7.5 minutes, and then the child talks for 5 to 7.5 minutes. and you just talk about your positive online experience that week without anything that's technological present, and no one gets to judge anybody in the conversation, and you have to act interested in what each other's saying. And so it sort of carries a thread into the offline world. And actually, it sounds really awkward, but it makes a huge difference. And then you want to talk about what's going on in their world. And this is, again, separate from if you're trying to do a behavior plan to reduce an unsafe behavior. This is just to have a positive technology experience with a child. A lot of parents ask, okay, so these things sound great, but should I be more strict or less strict, and what should I be doing here? The literature still says that whether we're authoritarian or permissive isn't so important as that we're consistent. So can a child expect the same response and the same set of rules for every technology experience? And are those rules determined through evidence-based assessment of the child's needs? And then finally, this is just more specific parent involvement. So talk to your child about what's dangerous online. And you want to be careful based on how old they are, about how much information you share, but just give some brief information. Assess your child's functioning using real-world information. So where do they struggle with safety in the walking, talking world, and how does that apply online? Can they recognize independently offline when something's unsafe? If they can't, then don't send them online without supervision. And then discuss access to the child's online activity. When someone gets their first Facebook or their first email, there have been a lot of parents who said sharing that with the child or teen has actually been really helpful to teach some of these strategies. And then you actually want to spend time online doing the things that they do. So go to their favorite websites, try their games for 10 minutes, just try it so you can sort of get some experience of what they're going through, and then discuss safety per site. And then I think the take-home message is that instead of seeing these virtual worlds as escapes from reality, we need to start to view them as extensions of reality, because that's how people with autism in the I generation are identifying these places. So we need to sort of be the thread that connects the online and the offline world to promote this overall safety and happiness. Questions?
I do a lot of these things. A lot of these things work. I really like that you talked about all the good things that the kids and young adults get from this, because I see so many good things that my kids get from the online world. The problem that they both have is with sleep. That during the day it's okay, but at night they're turning towards different screen activities to deal with the fact that they do have sleeping problems, and that these are ways to calm their anxiety. But the screens themselves, of course, are making their sleep problems worse. What do you suggest for that?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really common problem. What the research says is that your brain needs like 2 hours before you actually hope to fall asleep of non-screen time. And so it's a great idea, but actually implementing it is really hard, especially because a lot of times when we use screens for like escape from some of these painful feelings or emotions or social experiences, it sort of becomes that replacement behavior for the strategies that are much harder working through these feelings. So there's a couple different things people have tried. People have tried just, there's a time of day when there's no more electronics. And then the supervision is anything from they all get put into a locked box to they all go to a place where they each have a spot, so that the child knows if I really need it, it's there, but it's supposed to be there so I can sleep. There's also a ton of sensory strategies that people have reported help, like so bathing, different sort of smells or scents or routines around sleep. But sometimes it's really hard to find anything that's quite as exciting as the video game or the online experience. We have had some parents that maybe they veto the electronics at 10 o'clock if they want everybody asleep by midnight, but then they provide like full presence or supervision for the child while they sort of get through this, get used to this idea that I have to fall asleep. It also can help to have more frequent breaks during the day. So even if you can't quite get that 2 hours before sleep, if you're going outside for 15 minutes every hour or two, it can sort of help teach the brain to disconnect from the online world. That's a big one. That's a big challenge.
Another question. Now they've developed glasses that block blue light. Has that helped much with getting to sleep, or is it really the stimulation? And
if you're replacing or trying to get them offline 2 hours before they go to bed, and yet they're using this fantasy world to block out thoughts of other stressors like school, for example, is removing the game time completely for that period disruptive because then they become flooded with those worries and concerns?
Yeah, so sometimes what you'll see in the beginning is similar to an extinction burst, where the first time you really try to get that 2 hours before bed, the feelings are going to be much stronger, the behaviors are going to be much bigger. And so then it's almost like you're in this holding period. You get through this period of time that's extremely stressful, and you start to see the behavior subside. But what's challenging is to get through that first couple weeks of we're really going to do this, we're really going to have the computers off. And then sometimes when a child is unable to communicate and there's not a lot of distractions, especially kids with executive functioning differences, you might find out more helpful information from them about what's going on at school or what's going on in their social worlds that's making it so there's such a strong need for escape.
could you address the blue blocking?
Yeah, so I've heard mixed things about it. I've heard that it helps if somebody can remember to use it. I've also heard that it's still like a screen, so it's still more interesting than other things. So it just depends on. It's really specific. It's something that you wanna.
This is sort of a question and answer to what she mentioned earlier, because I'm a technology person, because I'm familiar with computers. There is a blue blocking filter that you put right over your monitor, whether it's a laptop or a regular computer monitor. You just simply slip it over and the blue light is blocked, which basically disengages the brain and allows it to relax faster, correct?
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to do, and I would say try it and see if you notice a difference. Yeah, and it may make it so that the brain isn't as elevated as it would normally be on a screen, but it still might be more interesting than sleeping because it's still a computer game.
They also offered accessible glasses. If you wear glasses, they're built right in, so it blocks the blue everywhere, I guess.
She was mentioning that the blue block is also available in glasses. So just to be mindful of our time today, I want to thank Madeline.